Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was a South Vietnamese politician, a former mandarin of the Nguyen dynasty. He was named Prime Minister of the State of Vietnam by Head of State Bảo Đại in 1954. In October 1955, after winning a heavily rigged referendum, he deposed Bảo Đại and established the First Republic of Vietnam with himself as president. He was a leader of the Catholic element and was opposed by Buddhists. In November 1963, after constant Buddhist protests and non-violent resistance, Diem was assassinated during a CIA-backed coup d'etat along with his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu by Nguyen Van Nung, the aide of the leader of the Army of Republic of Vietnam, General Nguyen Văn Minh. Diem has been a controversial historical figure in historiography on Vietnam War scholarship. Some historians portrayed him as a tool of the U.S. policymakers. Some considered him an avatar of Vietnamese tradition. Nevertheless, some recent studies have portrayed Diem, from a more Vietnamese-centred perspective, as a competent leader, with his own vision on nation-building and modernization of South Vietnam. Family and early life. Diem was born in 1901 in Quang Binh, a central Vietnam province. His family originated in the Phu Cam district, a Catholic district in Hue City. His clan had been among Vietnam's earliest Catholic converts in the 17th century. Diem was given a saint's name at birth, Gia Beotixita, following the custom of the Catholic Church. The Ngo Dinh family, along with other Vietnamese Catholics, suffered from anti-Catholic persecutions from emperors Minh Mang and TTHC. In 1880, while Diem's father Ngo Dinh Ca was studying in British Malaya, an anti-Catholic riot led by Buddhist monks almost wiped out the entire Ngo Dinh family. Over 100 of the Ngo clan were burned alive in a church, including Ca's parents, brothers, and sisters. Note that while he is usually referred to as Diem in English, his family name is actually Ngo, which is the Vietnamese form of the surname Wu. In Chinese, his name is, which in Mandarin Pinyin is Wu Tingyan. Ngo Dinh Ca, who was educated in a Catholic school in British Malaya where he learned English and European-style curriculum, was a devout Catholic and scrapped plans to become a Roman Catholic priest in the late 1870s. He also worked for French Armed Forces commander as an interpreter, and took part in campaigns against anti-colonial rebels in the mountains of Tonkin during 1880. Then he became a high-ranking mandarin, the first headmaster of the National Academy in Hue, which was founded in 1896, and a counselor to Emperor Thanh Tai during French colonization. He also rose to become a minister of the rights and chamberlain and keeper of the eunuchs. Despite his collaboration with the French colonizers, Ca was motivated less by Francophilia than by certain reformist ambitions, and alike Phan Chau Trinh, Ca believed that independence from France could only come from the changes in Vietnamese politics, society and culture. In 1907, after the ouster of Emperor Thanh Tai, Ca resigned and withdrew from the royal court, and became a farmer in the countryside. After the tragedy of his family, Ca decided to give up being a priest and got married. Ca had 9 children, 6 sons and 3 daughters, by his second wife Pham Thi. Then after his first wife died childless. They were Ngo Dinh Coi, Ngo Dinh Thigiao, Ngo Dinh Thuc, Ngo Dinh Diem, Ngo Dinh Thi Hiep, Ngo Dinh Thi Hoang, Ngo Dinh Nhu, Ngo Dinh Cien, Ngo Dinh Luyen. As a devout Roman Catholic, Ca took his entire family to Mass every morning and encouraged his sons to study for priesthood. Mastering both Latin and classical Chinese made sure that his children were well educated in Christian scriptures and Confucian classics. During his childhood, Diem labored in the family's rice fields while studying at a French Catholic primary school in Hue, and later entered a private school started by his father where he studied French, Latin and classical Chinese. At the age of 15 he followed his elder brother Ngo Dinh Diem, who would later become Vietnam's highest-ranking Catholic bishop, into a monastery. Diem even swore himself to celibacy to prove his devotion to his faith before he decided not to pursue clerical career due to finding monastic life too rigorous. According to Moya, Diem's personality was too independent to discipline himself in the church. He also inherited his father's antagonism toward the French colonialists who occupied his country. At the end of his secondary schooling in Lycée Huc, Hoc his very high examination results at the French Lycée in Hue saw him offered a scholarship to Paris, but he declined and enrolled to study at the prestigious School of Public Administration and Law in Hanoi, a French school that educated Vietnamese bureaucrats in 1918. It was there that he had the only romantic relationship of his life when he fell in love with one of his teacher's daughters. After she persisted with her vocation entering a convent, he remained celibate for the rest of his life. Diem's family background and education, especially Catholicism and Confucianism, had influences on his life and his career. His thinking on politics, society and history, according to Miller, Diem displayed Christian piety in everything from his devotional practices to his habit of inserting references to the Bible into his speeches. He also made Confucius' birthday a state holiday and liked to show off his knowledge of classical Chinese texts. Nevertheless, being a Catholic and a Confucian does not mean Diem was trapped by pre-modern visions. Early career. After graduating at the top of his class in 1921, Diem followed in the footsteps of his eldest brother Ngo Dinh Diem, joining the civil service in Trois Thien as a junior official. Starting from the lowest rank of mandarin, Diem steadily rose over the next decade. He first served at the Royal Library in Hue, and within 1 year was the district chief in both Trois Thien and nearby Quang Tri province, presiding over 70 villages. Diem was promoted to be a provincial chief in Ninh Thuan at the age of 28, overseeing 300 villages. During his career as a mandarin, Diem was reputable for his workaholism and incorruptibility, a Catholic leader and nationalist. Besides Catholic nationalism in Vietnam during 1920s and 1930s facilitated Diem's ascent in his bureaucratic career. Diem's rise was also supported through Ngo Dinh Diem's marriage to the daughter of Ngu Dinh Bai, the Catholic head of the Council of Ministers at the Hue Court, and also supported the indigenization of the Vietnamese church and more administrative powers to the monarchy. Ngu Dinh Bai was highly regarded among the French, and Diem's religious and family ties impressed him, and he became Diem's patron. The French were impressed by his work ethic but were irritated by his frequent calls to grant more autonomy to Vietnam. Diem replied that he contemplated resigning, but encouragement from the populace convinced him to persist. In 1925, he first encountered communists distributing propaganda while riding horseback through the region near Quang Tri. Revolted by calls for violent socialist revolution contained in the propaganda leaflets, Diem involved himself in anti-communist activities for the first time, printing his own pamphlets. In 1929 he was promoted to the governorship of Binh Thuan province and was reputable for his work ethics. In 1930 and 1931, he helped the French suppress the first peasant revolts organized by the communists. According to Fall, Diem put the revolution down because he did not support the revolution, which he thought could not sweep out the French, but might threaten the leadership of the mandarins. In 1933, with the return of Bảo Đại to ascend the throne, Diem agreed Bảo Đại invitation to be his interior minister following lobbying by Ngo Dinh. Soon after his appointment, Diem headed a commission to advise for potential administration reforms. After calling for the French to introduce a Vietnamese legislature and many other political reforms, he resigned after 3 months in office when this and other proposals were rejected. Diem denounced Emperor Bảo Đại as nothing but an instrument in the hands of the French, and renounced his decorations and titles from Bảo Đại. The French then threatened him with arrest and exile. For the next decade, Diem lived as a private citizen with his family in Hue. Although he was kept under surveillance, he spent his time on reading, meditating, attending church, gardening, hunting, amateur photography. Besides, Diem also extensively conducted his nationalist activities during those 21 years with meetings and correspondence with various leading Vietnamese revolutionaries such as his friend Phan Boi Chau, a Vietnamese anti-colonial activist who Diem respected for his knowledge of Confucianism and argued that Confucianism's teachings could be applied to a modern Vietnam. With the start of the Second World War in the Pacific, seeing an opportunity for Vietnam to challenge French colonization from the presence of Japan, he attempted to persuade the Japanese forces to declare independence for Vietnam in 1942, but was ignored. Diem also tried to establish relationships with Japanese diplomats, army officers, and intelligence operatives who supported Vietnam's independence. In 1943, Diem's Japanese friends helped him to contact Prince Seung Th, an anti-colonial activist who was exiled in Japan. After contacting Seung Th, Diem formed a secret political party, the Association for the Restoration of Great Vietnam, which was dominated by his Catholic allies in Hue. When its existence was discovered in the summer of 1944, the French declared Diem to be a subversive and ordered his arrest. He flew to Saigon under Japanese military protection, staying there until the end of World War II. In 1945, after the coup against French colonial rule, the Japanese offered Diem the post of Prime Minister in the Empire of Vietnam under Bảo Đại, which they organized on leaving the country. He declined initially but regretted his decision and attempted to reverse the offer. Nevertheless, Bảo Đại had already given the post to Trn Trong Kim. In September 1945, after the Japanese withdrawal, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and in the northern half of Vietnam, his Viet Minh began fighting the French. Diem attempted to travel to Hue to dissuade Bảo Đại from joining Ho, but was arrested by the Viet Minh along the way and exiled to a highland village near the border. He might have died of malaria, dysentery, and influenza had the local tribesmen not nursed him back to health. 6 months later, he was taken to meet Ho, who recognized Diem's virtues and wanted to extend the support for his new government, and was asked to be Minister of Interior. But Diem refused to join the Viet Minh assailing Ho for the murder of his brother Ngo Dinh Diem by Viet Minh cadres. During the Indochina War, Diem and other non-communist nationalists had to face a dilemma. They did not want to restore colonial rule and did not want to support the Viet Minh. Diem proclaimed his neutrality, and attempted to establish a third force movement that was both anti-colonialist and anti-communist. In 1947, he became the founder-in-chief of the National Union Bloc, and then folded it into the group Vietnam National Rally, which gathered non-communist Vietnamese nationalists. He also established the relationships with some leading Vietnamese anti-communists like Nguyen Thanh Hon, a fellow Catholic and political activist. His other allies and advisors were dominated by the Catholics, especially his family's members and their friends. Besides, Diem also secretly maintained contact with Democratic Republic of Vietnam's high-ranking leaders to convince them to leave Ho Chi Minh's government and join him. At the same time, he lobbied French colonial officials for a true independence for Vietnam. Nevertheless, Diem was disappointed when in June 1948 Bảo Đại signed an agreement to grant Vietnam as an associated state within the French Union, which allowed France to maintain its diplomatic, economic and military policies in Vietnam. In the meantime, the French had started the state of Vietnam and Diem refused Bảo Đại offer to become the prime minister. On 16 June 1949, he then published a new manifesto in newspapers proclaiming a third force different from Viet Minh and Bảo Đại, but raised little interest, and otherwise his statement was evident to both the French and Viet Minh that Diem was a dangerous rival. In 1950 the Viet Minh lost patience and sentenced him to death in absentia, and the French refused to protect him. Ho Chi Minh's cadres tried to assassinate him while he was traveling to visit his elder brother Thuc, bishop of the Vĩnh Long diocese in the Mekong Delta. Recognizing of his political status, Diem decided to leave Vietnam in 1950. According to Miller, during his early career there were at least three trends of ideologies which influenced Diem's social and political visions in the 1920s and 1930s. They were Catholic nationalism, which Diem inherited from his family's tradition, especially from Cardinal Ngo Dinh Thuc, his brother, and Nguyen Hu Bai, who advised him to return the seal in 1933 to oppose French policies. The second one was Diem's understanding of Confucianism, especially through his friendship with Phan Boi Chau, who argued that Confucianism's teachings could be applied to a modern Vietnam. More importantly, during those years instructed by Ngo Dinh Nhu, Diem began to examine personalism, which originated from French Catholicism's philosophy, and then applied this doctrine as the main ideology of his regime. Exile. Diem applied for permission to travel to Rome for the Holy Year celebrations at the Vatican. After gaining French permission, he left in August 1950 with his older brother, Bishop Ngo Dinh Thuc. Before going to Europe, Diem went to Japan, where he met with Prince Seung Th, his former ally, and discussed Seung Th's efforts to return to Vietnam and his capacity to play some roles in his homeland. Diem's friend also managed to organize a meeting between him and Wesley Fischel, an American political science professor at University of California who was working for CIA in Japan. Fischel was a proponent of the anti-colonial, anti-communist Third Force doctrine in Asia, and was impressed with Diem and helped him organize connections in the United States. In 1951, Diem flew to the United States to seek the support of government officials. Nevertheless, Diem was not successful in winning the U.S. support for Vietnamese anti-communists. He continued on, and flew to Europe. In Rome, Diem obtained an audience with Pope Pius XII at the Vatican before undertaking further lobbying across Europe. He also met with French and Vietnamese officials in Paris and sent a message indicating that he was willing to be the Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam to Bảo Đại. But Bảo Đại then refused to meet him. Diem returned to the United States to continue building support among Americans. Nonetheless, to Americans, the fact that Diem was an anti-communist could not distinguish him from Bảo Đại and other state of Vietnam leaders. Some American officials worried that his Catholic devoutness could hinder his ability to mobilize support in a non-Catholic predominant country. Diem recognized that hesitation, and in the course of his lobbying besides anti-communism and religious factors, Diem also focused on another ground, ideas of development. Since the US was enthusiastic in applying their technology and knowledge to modernize post-colonial countries. With the help of Fischel, Diem was appointed as a consultant to Michigan State University's Government Research Bureau where Fischel worked. MSU was administering government-sponsored assistance programs for Cold War allies, and Diem helped Fischel to lay the foundation for a program later implemented in South Vietnam, the Michigan State University Vietnam Advisory Group. The Americans' assessments of Diem were varied. Some were unimpressed with him, some admired him. Diem gained favor with some high-standing officials such as Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, Roman Catholic Cardinal Francis Spellman, Representative Mike Mansfield of Montana, and Representative John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, along with numerous journalists, academics, and the legendary spy chief of CIA William J. Donovan. Although he did not succeed in winning in official support from the U.S., his personal interactions with American political leaders promised his prospect in gaining more support in the future. Mansfield remembered after the luncheon with Diem held on May 8, 1953, he felt that if anyone could hold South Vietnam, it was somebody like Ngo Dinh. During Diem's exile period, his brothers Ngo Dinh Nhu, Ngo Dinh Cien and Ngo Dinh Luyen played important roles in helping him to build international and internal networks and supports in different ways for the return of Diem to Vietnam. In the early 1950s, Nhu established Cien Lao Party, which played a key role in helping Diem attain and consolidate his power. Being Prime Minister and consolidation of power. Until 1953, the state of Vietnam was nominally independent from Paris. Since dissatisfaction with France and Bảo Đại rose among non-communist nationalists and support from non-communist nationalists and Diem's allies for him increased for his true independence point of view from France, Diem sensed that it was time for him to come to power in Vietnam. In early 1954, Bảo Đại offered Diem the prime minister position of the new government in Vietnam. In May 1954, the French surrendered at Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Conference began in April 1954. On 16 June 1954, Diem met with Bảo Đại in France and agreed to be the prime minister if Bảo Đại would give him military and civilian control. On 25 June 1954, Diem returned from exile, arriving at Tan Son Nht Airport in Saigon. On 7 July 1954, Diem established his new government with a cabinet of 18 people. On 21 July 1954, the Geneva Accords resulted in Vietnam being partitioned temporarily at the 17th parallel, pending elections in 1956 to reunify the country. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam controlled the north, while the French-backed state of Vietnam controlled the south with Diem as the prime minister. Diem criticized the French for abandoning North Vietnam to the communists at Geneva, claimed that the terms did not represent Vietnamese people's will and refused French suggestion to include more pro-French officials in the government. In the first period of his premiership, Diem did not have much power in the government, lacked military and police forces, and the civil system's key positions were still held by French officials. He could not also control the Bank of Indochina. Besides, Diem had to face with massive obstacles, the refugee issues. The French colonists wanted to remove Diem to protect France's interest in South Vietnam. General Nguyen Van Hinh, a Francophile, The leader of National Army was ready to oust Diem. The leaders of Hoa Hao and Cao Tai sect armies wanted positions in Diem's cabinet and complete administrative control over the large following areas and the major threat of Binh Duyen, an organized crime syndicate, controlled national police led by Le Van Vienne, whose power was focused in Saigon in summer 1954. The three organizations controlled approximately one-third of the territory and population in South Vietnam. In that situation, besides his own political skills, Diem had to trust in his relatives and the backing of his American supporters to overcome the obstacles and neutralize his opponents. The accords allowed for freedom of movement between the two zones until October 1954. This put a large strain on the South. Diem had only expected 10,000 refugees, but by August, there were over 200,000 waiting in Hanoi and Haiphong to be evacuated. The migration helped to strengthen Diem's political base of support. To deal with the refugee matter, Diem's government arranged them to live in two fertile and underpopulated provinces in the western Mekong Delta. Diem regime also provided them with food and shelter, farm tools and housing material. The government also dug irrigation canals, built dikes and dredged swamplands to help stabilize their lives. In August 1954, Diem also had to face the Hin crisis when Nguyen Van Hin launched a series of public attacks on Diem, proclaiming that South Vietnam needed a strong and popular leader. Hin also bragged that he was preparing a coup. However, in the end of 1954, Diem successfully forced Hin to resign from his post. Hin had to flee to Paris and hand over his command of National Army to General Nguyen Van Vy. But then, the National Army officers came out in favor of Diem's leadership over General Vy, which forced him to flee to Paris. Despite its failure, the French continued to encourage Diem's enemies in an attempt to destabilize him. On the 31st of December 1954, Diem established the National Bank of Vietnam and replaced currently Indo-Chinese banknote by new Vietnamese banknotes. In early 1955, although American advisors incited Diem to negotiate with the leaders of the political religious forces who threatened to overthrow his position and to forge an anti-communist bloc, he was determined to attack his enemies to consolidate his power. In April 1955, Diem's army forces took most of Binh Duyen's posts in Saigon after a victory in the Battle of Saigon. Within a few months, Diem's troops wiped out the Binh Duyen's remnants, leaving only a few small bands, who then joined forces with the communists. The failure of Binh Duyen marked the end of French efforts to remove Diem. After the defeat of Binh Duyen, the authority and prestige of Diem's government increased. Most of Cao Tai leaders chose to rally to Diem's government. Diem then further dismantled the private armies of the Cao Tai and Hoa Ha religious sects. By the end of 1955, Diem had almost taken control of South Vietnam and his government was stronger than it had ever been before. In April 1956, along with the capture of Ba Kut, the leader of the last Hoa Ha rebels, Diem almost subdued all of his non-communist enemies and could focus on his Vietnamese communist opponents. According to Miller, Diem's capacity in subduing his enemies and consolidating his power strengthened the support to his government of the U.S., who had planned to withdraw its backing from Diem during his early difficult years of leadership. Establishment of Republic of Vietnam. In South Vietnam, a referendum was scheduled for the 23rd of October 1955. To determine the future direction of the South, in which the people would decide to choose Diem or Bảo Đại as the leader of South Vietnam. During the election, Diem's brother Ngo Dinh Nhu and the Cien Lao party supplied Diem's electoral base in organizing and supervising the elections, especially the propaganda campaign far destroying Bảo Thai's reputation. Supporters of Bảo Thai were not allowed to campaign. Official results showed 98.2% of voters favored a republic, an implausibly high result that was condemned as fraudulent. The total number of votes for or exceeded the number of registered voters by over 380,000, and further evidence that the referendum was heavily rigged. For example, only 450,000 voters were registered in Saigon, but 605,025 were said to have voted for a republic. On 26 October 1955, Diem proclaimed the formation of the Republic of Vietnam, with himself as its first president. Elections were scheduled to reunify the country in 1956. But Diem refused to hold them, claiming that a free election was not possible in the North. According to Taylor, the rejection of Diem of the Geneva Accord was a way of objecting to the French colonialism of Vietnam, Diem's disposition over Bảo Thai, and the establishment of the First Republic of Vietnam was a way to claim Vietnamese independence from France. At the same time, the first Constitution of Republic of Vietnam was promulgated. According to the Constitution, Diem had almost absolute power over South Vietnam. His governance style became increasingly dictatorial over time. The Can Lao Party played a key role in Diem's regime. Initially, the party acted secretly based on a network of cells, and each member only knew a few members' identities. When necessary, the party could replace the role of the government. After 1954, the existence of the party was recognized, but its activities have been hidden from public view. In the early 1950s, Diem and Nhu used the party to mobilize support for Diem's political movements. According to the Decree 116 BNV, CT of Republic of Vietnam, the Can Lao Party was established on 2 September 1954. The personalism officially became the basic doctrine of Diem's regime, since the Constitution's preface declared that building politics, economy, society, culture for the people basing on respecting personalism. According to Miller, democracy to Diem was rooted in his dual identity as Confucian and Catholic, and was associated with communitarianism and the doctrine of personalism. He defined democracy as a social ethos based on certain sense of moral duty, not in the U.S. sense of political right or political pluralism, and in the context of an Asian country like Vietnam. Confucian values were relevant to deal with contemporary problems in politics, governance, and social change. In this sense, Diem was not a reactionary mandarin, and lacking an interest in democracy like the way he has been portrayed by some scholars. His way of thinking about democracy became key factor of his approach to political and administrative reform. On 4 March 1956, the first RVN National Assembly was held in a more free and fair than the referendum in 1955. However, Diem's regime of democratic one-man rule faced the increasing difficulties. After coming under pressure from within the country and the United States, Diem agreed to hold legislative elections in August 1959 for South Vietnam. But in reality, newspapers were not allowed to publish names of independent candidates or their policies, and political meetings exceeding 5 people were prohibited. Candidates who ran against government-supported opponents had to face harassment and intimidation. In the rural areas, candidates who ran were threatened using charges of conspiracy with the Viet Cong, which carried the death penalty. Phan Quang Nhan, the government's most prominent critic, was allowed to run, despite the deployment of 8,000 ARVN plainclothes troops into his district to vote, and still won by a ratio of 6-1. The busing of soldiers occurred across the country and, when the new assembly convened, then was arrested. Socio-economic policies. During his presidency, Diem imposed the programs to reform Saigon society in accordance with Catholic and Confucian values. Brothels and opium dens were closed, divorce and abortion were made illegal, and adultery laws were strengthened. Besides, Diem's government established many schools and universities such as the National Technical Center at Phu Tho in 1957, the University of Saigon, the University of Hue, the University of Da La. Diem also paid attention to the preservation of Vietnamese traditional culture. Diem restored and organized some traditional festivals such as Hung King's Ancestor Festival, the Trung Sisters Festival. According to Diem, the values of traditional culture along with Catholic and Confucian values were powerful to fight against materialism. Regarding economic development in the political program of Kun Lao Party and National Revolutionary Movement, Diem and NHU pointed out the key factors of the RVN economy: a developed and independent economy, support local capitalists, stabilized currency and reduce budget deficit, enhance building infrastructure to meet military needs, and create a prosperous South Vietnam. In 1957, Diem's government suggested the 5-year plan, which aimed at expanding cultivated area to 20% and improving agricultural production to 25%, restoring exploitative industry and developing infrastructure. On 31 December 1955, Diem promulgated the Decree 48 on RVN independence on currency and banknotes. Diem's government also encouraged the development of handicraft industry and commerce. In October 1957, Diem established Center for Technological Development for investment, instruction, cooperation and support private technological activities, to gradually diminish the role of foreign capitalists, especially French capitalists, in industry, and to enhance the role of indigenous capitalists in RVN economy. In 1961, Diem suggested the second 5-year plan to continue the first 5-year plan. During the First Republic of Vietnam, some indigenous industrial zones or factories were founded, such as paper factory Kagido and Anh textile factories Vinitexo and Vimitex, glassware factory Can Hoi, cement factories Ha Tien and 2THC, hydroelectric power factory Ta Nhim Ta Lat, nuclear research center Bien Hoa industrial zone. During 1956-1960, Diem built a relatively stable RVN with a stable economy along with the development in infrastructure and people's standards of living due to export of home comforts. Nevertheless, Diem also admitted the dependence of RVN's economy on the U.S. assistance. Today, the country is not self-sufficient. We can say that foreign assistance is a kind of compensation for the services our people have provided to the free world to protect sea market and to fight against manipulations of international communism. Rural development. During Diem's reign, the Commissariat General for Civic Action was established in March 1955 to improve the intellectual level of the rural population and to raise the standard of living in rural areas in view to setting up a democratic basis and to promote a rural and material rearmament among the people. The civic action was considered a practical tool of Diem's government to serve the power vacuum and make a rural influence for Diem's government in countryside due to the departure of Viet Minh cadres after the Geneva Accords. Stewart's study provides a clearer picture of Diem's domestic policies and a further understanding of his government's efforts in reaching and connecting with local communities in South Vietnam that shows an indigenous initiative of South Vietnam government in building an independent and viable nation. Land reform in South Vietnam, especially in Mekong Delta, land holdings in rural areas were concentrated in small number of rich landlord families. Thus, it was urgent to implement land reform in South Vietnam. Diem had two attempts to control the excesses of the land tenancy system by promulgating the Ordinance 2 on 28 January 1955, to reduce land rent between 15–25% of the average harvest, and the Ordinance 7 on 5 February 1955 to protect the rights of tenants on new and abandoned land, and enhancing cultivation. In October 1956, with the urge from Wolf Lajinsky, Diem's personal advisor on agrarian reform, Diem promulgated a more serious ordinance on the land reform in which he proclaimed a land to the tiller program to put a relatively high 100 hectares limit on rice land and 15 hectares for ancestral worship. However, this measure had no real effect, because many landlords evaded the redistribution by transferring the property to the name of family members. Besides, during the 1946–54 war against the French Union forces, the Viet Minh had gained control of parts of southern Vietnam, initiated land reform, confiscated landlords' land and distributed it to the peasants. Additionally, the ceiling limit was more than 30 times that allowed in Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, and the 370,000 acres of the Catholic Church's landownings in Vietnam were exempted. The political, social and economic influences of the land reform was minimal. From 1957 to 1963, only 50% of expropriated land was redistributed, and only 100,000 out of approximately 1 million tenant farmers in South Vietnam benefited from the reform. Resettlement, according to Miller Diem, who described tenant farmer as real proletariat and pursued the goal of middle peasantization, was not a beholden of large landowners instead of vigorously implementing land reform. Diem had his own vision in Vietnamese rural development based on resettlement, which focused on redistribution of people, could reduce overpopulation and lead to many benefits in socio-economic transformation as well as military affairs and security, especially anti-communist infiltration. Moreover, Diem was ambitious to envision resettlement as a tactic to practice the government's ideological goals. The U.S. and Diem's differences over nation-building in countryside shaped the clashes in their alliance. The Khai San resettlement project, in late 1955, with the help of U.S. material support and expertise, Diem's government implemented the Project Khai San in An Giang province, which aimed to resettle 100,000 northern refugees. The Land Development Program, in early 1957, Diem started a new program called the Land Development to relocate poor inhabitants, demobilized soldiers and minority ethnic groups in central and southern Vietnam into abandoned or unused land in Mekong Delta and Central Highland, and cultivating technological and scientific achievements to transform South Vietnam and ensure security and prevent communist infiltration. Diem believed that the program would help improve civilians' lives, teach them the values of being self-reliant and hard-working. At the end of 1963, the program had built more than 200 settlements for 250,000 people. Nevertheless, the lax of conditions in these areas, along with the corruption and mercilessness of local officials, failed the program. Agroville program, during late 1959 and early 1960, motivated by the idea of population regroupment, Diem introduced the Agroville program, which he intended to physically relocate residents who lived in remote and isolated regions in Mekong Delta into new settlements in dense and prosperous areas, proposing to offer them urban modernity and amenities without leaving their farms and to keep them far away from the communists. Nonetheless, by late 1960, Diem had to admit that the program's objective failed, since the residents were not happy with the program and the communists infiltrated the program, and he had to discard it. According to Miller, the US and Diem's disagreement in their approaches to agrarian reform in countryside made their alliance move steadily from bad to worse. Counter-insurgency. During his presidency, Diem strongly focused on his central concern, internal security, to protect his regime as well as maintain order and social change, staunch anti-subversion and anti-rebellion policies. After the Binh Xuyen was defeated and the Hoa Hao, Cao Tai were subdued, Diem concentrated on his most serious threat, the communists. Diem's main measures for internal security were threats, punishment and intimidation. According to Gabriel Kolko, about 12,000 suspected opponents of Diem were killed between 1955 and 1957, and by the end of 1958 an estimated 40,000 political prisoners had been jailed. At the end of 1959, Diem was able to entirely control each family, and the communists had to suffer their darkest period in their history. The number of membership declined by 2/3, and had almost no power in the countryside of South Vietnam. Diem's repression extended beyond communists to anti-communist dissidents and anti-corruption whistleblowers. In 1956, after the anti-communist denunciation campaign, Diem issued Ordinance No. 6, which placed anyone who was considered threat to the state and public order in jail or house arrest. Nevertheless, Diem's hard policies led to fear and resentment in many quarters in South Vietnam and negatively affected his relations with the U.S. in terms of counter-insurgent methods. On the 22nd of February 1957, when Diem delivered a speech at an agricultural fair in Buon Ma To, a communist cadre named Ha Minh Tri attempted to assassinate the president. He approached Diem and fired a pistol from close range but missed, hitting the Secretary for Agrarian Reform's left arm. The weapon jammed, and security overpowered Tri before he was able to fire another shot. Diem was unmoved by the incident. The assassination was the response of the desperation of the communists to Diem's relentless anti-communist policies. As opposition to Diem's rule in South Vietnam grew, a low-level insurgency began to take shape there in 1957. Finally, in January 1959, under pressure from Southern Viet Cong cadres who were being successfully targeted by Diem's secret police, Hanoi Central Committee issued a secret resolution authorizing the use of armed insurgency in the South with supplies and troops from the North. On the 20th of December 1960, under instructions from Hanoi, Southern Communists established the Viet Cong in order to overthrow the government of the South. On the 11th of November 1960, a failed coup attempt against President Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam was led by Lieutenant Colonel Vong Van Thong and Colonel Nguyen Chan Thi of the Airborne Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. There was a further attempt to assassinate Diem and his family in February 1962, when two Air Force officers, acting in unison, bombarded the presidential palace. In 1962, the cornerstone of Diem's counter-insurgency efforts, the strategic Hamlet program, the last and most ambitious of Diem's government's nation-building schemes, was implemented, which called for the consolidation of 14,000 villages of South Vietnam into 11,000 secure hamlets each, with its own houses, schools, wells and watchtowers supported by South Vietnamese government. The hamlets were intended to isolate the National Liberation Front from the villages. their source of recruiting soldiers, supplies and information, as well as transform the countryside. In the end, although the strategic hamlet program was not successful as it was expected, because of many shortcomings, and cancelled after the assassination of Diem, according to Miller, the strategic hamlet program created a remarkable turnabout in the Diem's regime in their war against communism, religious policies and the Buddhist crisis. Many historians have claimed that Diem's religious policies favored Catholics, and that he persecuted many Buddhists. According to Buttinger, the distribution of weapons to village self-defense militias intended to repel Viet Cong guerrillas saw weapons only given to Catholics. Some Buddhist villages converted en masse in order to receive aid, or avoid being forcibly resettled by Diem's regime. Kainau points out that the Catholic Church was the largest landowner in the country, and the private status that was imposed on Buddhism by the French, which required official permission to conduct public Buddhist activities, was never repealed by Diem. Jacobs also shows that Catholics were also de facto exempt from the corvée labor that the government obliged all citizens to perform. U.S. aid was disproportionately distributed to Catholic-majority villages. Nonetheless, according to Moyar, Diem had contributed to Buddhist communities in South Vietnam by giving them permission to carry out activities that were banned by French, building more pagodas, and supported money for Buddhist schools ceremonies. Among 18 members of Diem cabinet ministers, there were 5 Catholics, 5 Confucians, 8 Buddhists, including a vice president and a foreign minister. Only 3 of the top 19 military officials were Catholics. The regime's relations with the United States worsened during 1963, as discontent among South Vietnam's Buddhist majority was simultaneously heightened. In May, in the heavily Buddhist central city of Hue, where Diem's elder brother was the Catholic archbishop, the Buddhist majority was prohibited from displaying Buddhist flags during Vesak celebrations commemorating the birth of Gautama Buddha, when the government cited a regulation prohibiting the display of non-government flags. A few days earlier, however, a Catholic flag flew at the 25th commemoration for Ngo Dinh Thuc's elevation to the rank of bishop. According to Miller, Diem then proclaimed the flag embargo because he was annoyed with the commemoration for Thuc. However, the ban on religious flag led to a protest led by Thich Tri Quang against the government, which was suppressed by Diem's forces, and unarmed civilians were killed in the clash. Diem and his supporters blamed the Viet Cong for the deaths and claimed the protesters were responsible for the violence. Although the provincial chief expressed sorrow for the killings and offered to compensate the victims' families, they resolutely denied that government forces were responsible for the killings and blamed the Viet Cong. According to Diem, it was the communists who threw a grenade into the crowd. The Buddhists pushed for a 5-point agreement, freedom to fly religious flags, and end to arbitrary arrests, compensation for the Hue victims, punishment for the officials responsible, and religious equality. Diem then banned demonstrations and ordered his forces to arrest those who engaged in civil disobedience. On 3 June 1963, protesters attempted to march towards the Tu Tham Pagoda. 6 waves of ARVN tear gas and attack dogs failed to disperse the crowds, and finally brownish-red liquid chemicals were doused on praying protesters, resulting in 67 being hospitalized for chemical injuries. A curfew was subsequently enacted. The turning point came in June when a Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Thc, set himself on fire in the middle of a busy Saigon intersection in protest of Diem's policies. Photos of this event were disseminated around the world, and for many people these pictures came to represent the failure of Diem's government. For an opposing view, see the review of M. Higgins' book Our Vietnam Nightmare. A number of other monks publicly self-immolated. and the US grew increasingly frustrated with the unpopular leader's public image in both Vietnam and the United States. Diem used his conventional anti-communist argument, identifying the dissenters as communists. As demonstrations against his government continued throughout the summer, the special forces loyal to Diem's brother Nhu conducted an August raid of the Exile pagoda in Saigon. Pagodas were vandalized, monks beaten, and the cremated remains of Quang Thc, which included his heart, a religious relic, were confiscated. Simultaneous raids were carried out across the country, with the Tu Tham Pagoda in Hue looted, the statue of Gautama Buddha demolished, and the body of a deceased monk confiscated. When the populace came to the defense of the monks, the resulting clashes saw 30 civilians killed and 200 wounded. In all, 1,400 monks were arrested and some 30 were injured across the country. The United States indicated its disapproval of Diem's administration when Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. visited the pagoda. No further mass Buddhist protests occurred during the remainder of Diem's rule. Madame Nhutrn Le Chuen Nhu's wife inflamed the situation by mockingly applauding the suicides, stating, "If the Buddhists want to have another barbecue, I will be glad to supply the gasoline." The pagoda raid stoked widespread public disquiet in Saigon. Students at Saigon University boycotted classes and rioted, which led to arrests, imprisonments, and the closure of the university. This was repeated at Hue University. When high school students demonstrated, Diem arrested them as well. Over 1,000 students from Saigon's leading high school, most of them children of Saigon civil servants, were sent to re-education camps, including reportedly children as young as 5, on charges of anti-government graffiti. Diem's foreign minister Vu Van Mu resigned, shaving his head like a Buddhist monk in protest. When he attempted to leave the country on a religious pilgrimage to India, he was detained and kept under house arrest. So far, there have been many interpretations for the Buddhist crisis and the immolation of Thich Quang Thc in 1963. Relating the events in a larger context of Vietnamese Buddhism in 20th century and looking at the interactions between Diem and Buddhist groups, Miller argues that the Buddhist protests during Diem's regime were not only the struggles for discrimination in religious practices and religious freedom, but also the resistances of Vietnamese Buddhism to Diem's nation-building policies centered by personalist revolution that Buddhists considered a threat to the revival of Vietnamese Buddhist power. Until the end of his life, Diem, along with his brother Nhu, still believed that their nation-building was successful, and they could resolve the Buddhist crisis in their own way, like what they had done with the Han crisis in 1954 and the struggle with the Binh Xuyen in 1955. Foreign policies. The foreign policy of the Republic of Vietnam, according to official to a very considerable extent, was the policy of Ngo Dinh Diem himself during this period. He was the decisive factor in formulating foreign policies of RVN. Besides the roles of his advisor Ngo Thin Nhu and his foreign ministers, Trn Van No, Vu Van Mu and Pham Thang Lam, who played subordinate roles in his regime. Nevertheless, since Diem had to pay much attention to domestic issues in the context of the Vietnam War, foreign policies did not receive appropriate attention from him. Diem paid more attention to countries that affected Vietnam directly, and he seemed to personalize and emotionalize relations with other nations. The issues Diem paid more attention in foreign affairs were the Geneva Accords, the withdrawal of the French international recognition and the cultivation of legitimacy of RVN, and the relations with the United States, Laos and Cambodia, and especially North Vietnam. Besides, RVN also focused on the diplomatic relations with other Asian countries to secure its international recognition. Diem's attitude toward India was not harmonized due to India's non-alignment policy, which Diem assumed favor of communism. It was not until in 1962, since India voted on a report to criticize the Communists for supporting invasion South Vietnam, Diem eventually reviewed his opinions toward India. For Japan, Diem's regime established the diplomatic relations for the recognition of war reparations, which led to a reparation agreement in 1959 with the amount of $49 million. Diem also established friendly relations with non-communist states, especially the Republic of Korea, the Republic of China, the Republic of the Philippines, the Kingdom of Thailand, the Kingdom of Laos, and the Federation of Malaya, where Diem's regime shared the common recognition of communist threats. RVN established diplomatic relations with Cambodia, India, Burma, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and Singapore. RVN also established diplomatic relations with Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Morocco, and Tunisia. Regarding the relations with Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Diem maintained total hostility and never had serious effort to establish any relations with them. In relations with France, as an anti-colonialism nationalist, Diem did not believe in France, and France was always a negative factor in his foreign policy. He also never looked upon France as a counterweight to American influence concerning relations with the U.S. Although Diem admitted the importance of the US-RVN alliance, he perceived that the US's assistance to RVN was primarily serving its own national interest rather than the RVN. Keith Taylor adds that Diem's distrust of the US grew because of its Laotian policy, which gave North Vietnam access to South Vietnam's border through southern Laos. Diem also feared the escalation of American military personnel in South Vietnam, which threatened his nationalist credentials and the independence of his government. In early 1963, the Ngo brothers even revised their alliance with the U.S. Moreover, they also disagreed with the U.S. on how to best react to the threat from North Vietnam. While Diem believed that before opening the political system for the participation of other political camps, military and security matters should be taken into account, the U.S. wanted otherwise, and was critical of Diem's clientelistic government, where political power based on his family members and trusted associates. The Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam decreased American confidence in Diem and eventually led to the coup d'état sanctioned by the U.S. Ultimately, nation-building politics shaped the evolution and collapse of the US-Diem alliance. The different visions in the meanings of concepts democracy, community security, and social change were substantial and were a key cause of the strains throughout their alliance. Coup and assassination. As the Buddhist crisis deepened in July 1963, non-communist Vietnamese nationalists and the military began preparations for a coup. Bui Diem, later South Vietnam's ambassador to the United States, reported in his memoirs that General Le Van Kim requested his aid in learning what the United States might do about Diem's government. Diem had contacts in both the embassy and with the high-profile American journalists then in South Vietnam, David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, and Malcolm Brown. The coup d'état was designed by a military revolutionary council including ARVN generals led by General Duong Van Minh. Lucien Conin, a CIA operative, had become a liaison between the U.S. Embassy and the generals, who were led by Trn Vang Thon. They met each other for the first time on the 2nd of October 1963. At Tan Son NHT Airport. 3 days later Conin met with General Nguyễn Văn Minh to discuss the coup and the stance of the U.S. towards it. Conin then delivered the White House's message of American non-intervention, which was reiterated by Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., the U.S. ambassador, who gave secret assurances to the generals that the United States would not interfere. Miller argues that the role of the U.S. in the coup should not be overstated, since the coup was mainly a Vietnamese affair already planned by the Vietnamese generals. Unlike the coup in 1960, the plotters of the 1963 coup knew how to gain broad support from other ARVN officer corps. They obtained the support of General Tun Th Thin, General Th Cao Tri, General Nguyen Khan, the 1st Corps and 2nd Corps commanders. Only General Hein Van Cao of 4th Corps remained loyal to Diem. On 1 November 1963, Minh and his co-conspirators overthrew the government in a swift coup, with only the palace guard remaining to defend Diem and his younger brother Nhu. The generals called the palace, offering Diem exile if he surrendered. That evening, however, Diem and his entourage escaped via an underground passage to Cha Tam Catholic Church in Colin, where they were captured the following morning, the 2nd of November. The brothers were assassinated together in the back of an M113 armored personnel carrier with a bayonet and revolver by Captain Nguyen Van Nung under orders from Minh given while en route to the Vietnamese Joint General Staff Headquarters. Diem was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery next to the house of the U.S. ambassador. Aftermath. Upon learning of Diem's ouster and assassination, Ho Chi Minh reportedly stated, "I can scarcely believe the Americans would be so stupid." The North Vietnamese Politburo was more explicit: the consequences of the 1st of November coup d'etat will be contrary to the calculations of the U.S. imperialists. Diem was one of the strongest individuals resisting the people and communism. Everything that could be done in an attempt to crush the revolution was carried out by Diem. Diem was one of the most competent lackeys of the U.S. imperialists. Among the anti-communists in South Vietnam or exiled in other countries, no one has sufficient political assets and abilities to cause others to obey. Therefore, the lackey administration cannot be stabilized. The coup d'etat on 1 November 1963 will not be the last. After Diem's assassination, South Vietnam was unable to establish a stable government, and several coups took place after his death, while the United States continued to influence South Vietnam's government. The assassination bolstered North Vietnamese attempts to characterize the South Vietnamese as supporters of colonialism. Diem's legacies. Diem's assassination led to the collapse of his regime, and the end of the First Republic of Vietnam. Nevertheless, Diem's contribution over his 9 years of power from 1954 to 1963 can be appreciated at many levels due to his part in resolving the refugee issue from the North, establishing and consolidating the power of his regime, subduing the sex crisis and pacifying the country. Diem stabilized an independent South Vietnam that had suffered in the First Indochina War, and built a relatively stable government in Saigon during the late 1950s. The normalcy and domestic security created conditions for economic recovery and development of education in South Vietnam, which contributed educated human resources to serve the nation. The system of universities were established during Diem's presidency, such as Hue University, Ta Lat University, University of Pedagogy, the University of Saigon, University of Agriculture and Forestry, Medical University of Hue, National Institute of Administration, which applied European and American-style vocational schools. which contributed to the education of Republic of Vietnam and still play important roles. Although many Southerners oppose his rule, others have noted Diem's asceticism, strong nationalism, and patriotism. Moreover, the values of personalism of the Ngo brothers has been revised lately. According to Nguyen Ngoc Tien, their personalist values along with their idea of a democratic ethical regime based on personalism, was both a combination of the quintessence of Western values and Asian values and a contribution to political science, especially in resolving the democratization issue in developing post-colonial countries, such as Vietnam today. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to